I'm Frances Bell and I have come to visit Andrew Festing. We're both members of the Royal Society of Portrait Painters and Andrew has agreed to sit for me for a painting and we're going to do this in his studio. So I plan on doing a lay-in on a canvas behind me and to ask him some questions as we go along. So was art somehow humming along in the background or were you sort of inculcated into it at school?
No, it was humming along in the background. My father's family, they were soldiers, they were actually quite artistic. So I get my artistic genes from my dad's side.
You have what is quite rare and very fortunate, I think, in any education, which is an extremely charismatic and capable art teacher when you were at school.
Yes, it was interesting actually. I would say that. As soon as somebody said, oh, it was interesting, you know you're going to be bored by it. I went to a school in Yorkshire called Ampleforth, there weren't many things that I liked about Ampleforth, but there were two good people at Ampleforth. One was my housemaster, who was the most enchanting, very benevolent monk, very wise old monk. And the other one was the art teacher. And the thing about him was that he wasn't a teacher at all. He wouldn't have known or couldn't have cared less about exams or anything like that, or O-levels or A-levels at all. But he was a professional sculptor. We didn't terribly like the schoolmasters, but anybody who was a professional, had a lot of respect. He made us draw and draw and draw, accurate drawing. We had a Benin head, bronze Benin head. And we used to sit in sort of serried ranks round the Benin head doing these accurate drawings.
We all say this is true, and I think it probably is, that if you can be as young as possible when you're learning something that's difficult, all the better for you. Yeah. You kind of absorb it. You had that, so you were young enough to be sponge-like. You could soak up all the things that he was saying to you. After school, quite a different tack and off into the army.
Well, I did at one point say to my father when I was aged about 17, look, I don't think I want to go into the army, I think I'd rather go to an arts college, whereupon there was a sort of minor nuclear explosion. And so that was banned. So I was sent packing off into the army. I then did 10 years in the army, which actually didn't really suit me at all. I'm not a corporate person, I'm bad at working in groups. You have to be a team player to be good in the army. I was never very good at being a team player. And then I got a job at Sotheby's. People used to sell old master paintings and that sort of thing for many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds. So sometimes I used to ask to have a copy. So I sat in the basement at Sotheby's doing quite a number of these copies. I spent a great deal of my time actually sitting quietly, studying these pictures incredibly carefully and trying to work out how the hell did he do that?
Yes.
I mean, if you could really have place to a picture, I enjoyed that enormously.
It is such an education, isn't it, copying something? It's almost like you're borrowing somebody's brain and trying them on and trying to
looking at pictures.
Because to suddenly, you go from school, which is wonderful, and then you go...
No, school was not, school wasn't very wonderful.
I mean quite, yes, it was probably rather difficult. But then total different environment, off into the army, and then this long period of doing something else, and then suddenly a professional portrait painter. Yeah,
occasionally people come to me and say, I've got a child who's very artistic and wants to become a painter. And my reaction is always the same, which is, for God's sake, tell him not to, or her not to. Under no circumstances, you've got to really discourage them as much as possible. The reason being that I do that is because you only succeed if you're incredibly keen on it, if you're absolutely dedicated. A lot of people sort of have this sort of slightly flaffy idea that they would love to go off to Florence or somewhere and study art. It's not really inbred into their guts. So what you want to do is try and discourage them, and if despite your discouragement they still do it, then you probably know that they are determined enough to make a success of it.
There's a lot of stereotypes about how painters float around drinking champagne in their dressing gowns until noon, and then eventually think about some work in the afternoon.
Yeah, I suppose the one thing about the army that I did learn, that is that you do in order to paint, particularly do portraits, you do actually have to have a considerable amount of self-discipline. It's a 9-to-5 job, it's hard work.
And there's this great premium set on the formality of an education, especially if you're a classical painter. There aren't very many painters you could name who didn't spend some period of time at an art school, but you're one of them, and that's because you were probably getting this great formal education in the basement at Sotheby's.
Yes.
Copying, painting.
Yes, yeah, exactly. There was a chap who was in the army with me, whose father was one of the archdeacons of the Diocese of Ely, and he was called Colin Fox. And Colin Fox got hold of me one day, just after I'd left the army, when I was working at Sotheby's, and said, did I know of anybody of a portrait painter who, because the Diocese of Ely wanted to commission a picture of the bishop. So I cheekily wrote back to Foxy saying, yes, I'll do it myself, and if they don't like it, they needn't have it. And the Bishop of Ely was a very sporting fellow. He said, okay, fine. So I painted him, and actually it still remains one of the best pictures I think I've painted. I just happen to have an ability to paint that sort of thing. That was the first professional portrait that I painted, and from then on it's all sort of, you know, if you paint one relatively decent picture, it leads on to another, on to another, and on to another.
And so then it all flooded in, and some of the most amazing commissions. I mean, it is quite something to read back through all of the places that you painted for, institutions, people.
Yeah.
And did they, I mean, could you believe it, really? I mean, you've got the House of Lords. You never get paintings like that these days. I mean, huge pictures. We've got a 5
House of Commons and House
gap.
of Lords almost drove me mad doing
I'm
those
not
pictures.
surprised. They are absolutely ginormous, and the scope too.
And they're quite a huge amount of work. I more or less completely ruined my eyesight painting the picture of the House of Lords.
How many people were there?
I think in the House of Lords, I think there were 500 or 600.
5
Perhaps
or
still 600 or 700. In the
100
House of
people.
Commons, there were about 170.
Oh, well, then that's easy.
That was easy.
I was thinking also of the cricket ground lords. You did
that's
the
right.
cricketers.
Cricketers, yes.
So there were
Yes.
a few canvases each for those, and again, were you getting the people to sit, or were you?
Yes, I got
trying
them to sit, and I've got the sketches of them downstairs here.
Do you?
I have all the sketches of all those people like Gooch and Gower and Gatting and all that lot.
I love the painting of Michael Lycett, and this is probably a painter's question rather than
Yeah.
But what I love about that is there's quite a lot of structure in that picture. There's a lovely portrait in the head.
Yeah.
And then this feathering down the shirt where he doesn't really have arms so much
Yeah.
as a suggestion of a shirt. And then
Yeah.
behind this lovely rigid set of lines, you use this quite a lot, a precise line that must
Yeah.
almost be drawn with a ruler. or something.
I often do love that.
The structure of that combined with this very loose impressionist
Yeah.
way that you also have. Were you sort of making these artistic decisions deliberately at that sort of moment, or did they kind of come out of the
They just
woodwork?
came out of the woodwork, I think, more or less.
Yeah.
What I tend to do is to draw things in quite carefully, really quite precisely, and then get the brush out and a lot of rather, perhaps, liquid paint, and then splash the liquid paint on top of the careful drawing. And then when you sort of what you might call messed it up with the loose paint, then go back to the careful drawing over the tops, and then drawing and then splashing.
And on each turn of splashing, you continue to keep the drawing very
Yes,
much through
the drawing
paint layers.
should sometimes, well not always, but most of the time it shows through from underneath.
Yeah.
I hardly do any overpainting at all.
So no glazes, scumbles.
No, I've never terribly liked glazes. I mean, I know that all the famous artists of the past have used glazes continuously, but I've never terribly liked it. I much prefer to paint it just straight on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So these pictures are quite quick then.
Basically, it takes me 2 days to paint a portrait.
Wow.
I draw it in the first day, and I paint it the second day, and then I more or less don't touch it thereafter.
And will this be preceded by a great deal of thought?
No.
No, it comes as it comes.
Comes as it comes, yeah, exactly.
So it's wonderfully instinctive, because you can tell that with the way the brushes are landing.
Yeah.
Why should a young artist paint from life?
That's a question that I often get asked and I often think about. if you paint a picture from photographs, it tends to become far too tight, and it tends to become almost too accurate, and it becomes just like a photorealism. Whereas if you're painting from life, things go wrong. People move, people change the angles of their heads a bit. You make mistakes, and that's what gives the picture life. And also, I'm always sort of concerned or very conscious of the fact that, you know, the great painters of the past didn't have photographs. You know, Van Dyck didn't have a photograph, nor did Frans Hals, nor did Velasquez. None of them had cameras. I mean, there's no doubt about it, they did use mechanical devices in a considerable way. I mean, somebody like Vermeer obviously did have some sort of camera system. So the artists did use every form of technical aid that was available to them. You shouldn't, in theory, I've always believed, if you're really good enough to be able to do it, you shouldn't really need a photograph. Also, if you're confronted with something which is in 3D as opposed to being 2D, you have to be able to work out how it is that you change things from a 3-dimensional to a 2-dimensional. That's a skill which you definitely need.
It's such a thorny question these days because it's very easy, isn't it, to use photographs, and I use them, but they are aide-memoire. They're there to help.
They're a prop, but that's all they are. Once they become something more than a prop, then I think that's a bad idea. A lot of the pictures that I've painted, I mean, most of the ones in that book were painted with no photographs at all. That, of course, does mean to say that you've got to have a cooperative sitter who's perfectly happy to sit for hours and hours and hours on end.
And you're very quick.
And you have to be relatively quick. But that's another reason why painting from life is good, because it teaches you to be quick, which is good.
Okay, well, we've done 2 hours, I'd say, something in that region.
Yeah.
And this is a lay-in, what I would call a lay-in, which is going to disappear under subsequent layers. So interesting to discover that that would never happen if this was Andrew painting this. But it's as rough as it could be and will develop from here. And obviously there's no body yet. I would focus on the head whilst I've got him. I would always just paint the head. I'll take it away, probably just soften out some bits and then plan what I'll do next and return, at a future date, to get another sitting at the other end. So that's the phase we're at the moment. I think what I love about the style is that it's so loose and impressionistic. It's actually very difficult to do, to land one brushstroke that wiggles all the way down the canvas and is spontaneous, it's uncurated. And all of these very careful, precise marks that he makes underneath slightly belies this impressionist at heart. But he's combining those two disciplines of being very rigorous, very careful, mapping out, very precise he must be, and then this wonderful stroke, totally free, unhindered, very little sort of seeming forethought, although there obviously is a lot. And I just think it's a lovely painterly style. It's very impressionistic, and it obviously, speaking to him, is something that is very much just coming out of him. I mean, it's quite odd. There's not a lot of study that goes ahead of it. He is literally just producing it, and I find it absolutely fascinating. It's just a wonderful style. I want you to talk, I think.
Well, me? I'm not very good at talking. But
no, but in the painting.
Oh, see.
Yeah, I'd like the end effect to...
Yeah, I see what you mean, yes.
To be
yes.
You're doing something, you're talking to the viewer.
Yeah.
Do you recognise any of the ways in which I've gone about it?
Well, Francis's approach is different to my approach, but the result is extremely effective.
It's so interesting because we're not fundamentally that different in the core of our practice, but I mean, arriving at it completely different
In a
way.
completely different way.
Yeah.
That's right. I think in many ways it's extremely good. It looks terribly like